right, everybody. Thank you for joining us. This is our September webinar. I'm Tim Pierotti, the Chief Investment Strategist here at WealthVest. I am joined, as always, by Drew Dokken, who's a senior member of our marketing and research team. And we are joined by our go-to expert and analyst on all things geopolitical, the moniker that he hates, Dr. Col Jeff McCausland. We will just go with Jeff from this point forward. Good. Far too modest to be called Dr. Col continuously. And if you haven't seen Dr. McCausland, he is outstanding. I'm sorry, I'll go with Jeff. But Jeff was a West Point graduate. He is an Army Ranger. He taught at West Point. He taught at Annapolis. He was the dean of the U.S. War College. Since retiring from the military, he has consulted and been an analyst for CBS News for 20 years now. And we got to know Jeff via his work with an independent research firm that consults hedge funds on Wall Street. So just know that as you're listening to Jeff, you are listening to somebody who is a go-to voice for a lot of hedge funds and asset managers on Wall Street. So with that too long introduction, let's dive right into it. What we want to do is we're going to run the globe here and all the hot spots. We will start with Israel and Gaza and Iran and their proxies. We'll discuss the situation in Ukraine and Russia, China, the Philippines and Taiwan. We'll talk about Venezuela and the other sort of oil and energy hotspots in the world. And throughout, we'll talk about how technology is evolving, and that's a good place to start because there's been some innovative ways to conduct warfare that we've learned about in just the last couple of days, Jeff, haven't we?
Without question. Thank you very much, Tim, for that very, very kind introduction. But as we examine Gaza, let's talk about what's going on in Gaza between Israel and Hamas. And then we'll talk for a minute of this startling development over the last 24, 48 hours of all these pagers and cell phones suddenly exploding in Lebanon. But as we approach really the first anniversary of the war in Israel, it's hard to imagine it was on 7 October 2023 that Hamas began this war with an invasion of Israel, killing over 1,200 Israelis in a brutal fashion, women, children, elderly, and terrorizing and wounding many, many more, that began this particular conflict. Since then, the Israelis have moved militarily into the Gaza Strip. And right now, sadly, we stand at roughly over 41,000 Palestinians have been killed. Somewhere around 95,000 have, in fact, been injured. Some very startling logistical things have ensued because of this dramatic humanitarian disaster this war has created. In the last week or so, for example, well over 600,000 Palestinian children have been vaccinated for polio, because we've seen a polio outbreak in Gaza, along with a breakdown of healthcare, no clean water, very little food. So this is a massive humanitarian disaster affecting nearly every person in the Gaza Strip in some fashion, that being over 2 million people. There had been a desire for a ceasefire. The Biden administration, along with Egypt and the United Arab Emirates, had been trying to broker a ceasefire between Hamas and Israel. And quite frankly, the possibility of achieving that seems to dim. The major sticking points seem to be on the Israeli side. The Israeli demand of military presence, what's called the Philadelphia Corridor, which is a narrow strip of land on the very southern end of the Gaza Strip. They want to control that to preclude Hamas from smuggling more weapons into the Gaza Strip. This is objected to by the Egyptians as well as Hamas. And then on the Hamas side, they have been arguing for more, in particular, Palestinians to be released from Israeli detention, Israeli prisons, in return for the release of the hostages. But those two sticking points, coupled with the recent, again, attacks in Beirut over the last few days, I think make the prospects for a ceasefire very, very limited. The Israeli military and political leadership have stated in the last week or so that they believe militarily Hamas has been pretty much defeated, but it may take them up to another year to completely end any type of political as well as military presence of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. As a consequence, the Israeli military are refocusing their attention to the northern part of Israel. Because when this war began over a year ago, Hezbollah, the terrorist organization in southern Lebanon, also joined the fight in support of Hamas, launching somewhere around 8,500 or more rockets, missiles, in addition to artillery, onto settlements in northern Israel. And as a consequence, about 60,000 or more Israelis have fled their homes, and for the last year nearly, they've been living in central Israel. Oh, by the way, about 80,000 Lebanese on the northern side have also fled their homes. So the Israelis have begun to move military forces northward and have said a military solution now seems to be the only option to get the war in the north end. And in fact, the Israeli cabinet in the last couple of days voted to make this defeat of Hezbollah, or the ending of the conflict with Hezbollah in the north, of equal importance to its other two objectives in this war, that being the full destruction of Hamas militarily and politically, as well as the release of the hostages. But this war has had other aspects to it, and we'll touch on quick, and then we'll go to Lebanon. And that has been that in the last week or so, we've seen the Houthis in Yemen launch a long-range missiles at Haifa in central Israel. It broke up. There wasn't a lot of destruction, but the fact that they did that and could do that shows you the war has the possibility of expanding dramatically. Shiite militia groups operating in Iraq actually launched a missile against Israel proper as well. And while all this is going on, the Israelis have also conducted a commando raid into Syria, another country they're involved in the region, to destroy a major weapons production facility for missile parts that was operated by Hezbollah, but on Syrian territory and supported by Iran. Well, that is the precursor to this startling story beginning on Tuesday of somewhere around 2,500 to 3,000 wireless devices, pagers, suddenly exploding at 3:30 in the afternoon after they had gone off. Right now, overall, I believe about 40 or so people have been killed. As many as about 3,000 have, in fact, been injured, because the following day, Wednesday, about 400 walkie-talkies also suddenly exploded, injuring several hundred people and killing a number of people. Hezbollah has blamed Israel for this particular attack. And Israelis have not taken credit for the attack, but the Israeli defense minister said we are refocusing our attention on the northern front. Some might question, well, why in the world was Hezbollah using pagers, a pretty old device? And the reason they had done that is they had shifted over to the use of pagers some 4 or 5 months ago, because they were concerned that cell phones were being tracked by the Israelis and then used for targeting. And a more unsophisticated technological device by a pager, they believed, was more difficult to trace. That's why they went to walkie-talkies and the pagers. Apparently, it's now believed the Israelis were able to interrupt the supply chain and put a small amount of Simtex, the plastic explosives, in the pagers and the walkie-talkies, 1 to 2 ounces, with some kind of a detonator that could be detonated based on a particular signal being sent to the phone. And that's exactly what happened. Really, 2 questions, I think, Tim, remain. First question is, why would you do that now? Why detonate those now? Because you might think, well, this is an enormous intelligence opportunity because we can eavesdrop on these devices. Most people, I think, believe the reason they did that was the Israeli intelligence became concerned that this particular effort might now become compromised. Hezbollah might discover what had happened, and therefore might as well detonate them now and get out of it whatever we can. That's why that occurred. The final and most important question is, and now what? What happens now? Certainly an enormous tactical success. It killed or injured a significant number of primarily Hezbollah leadership, certainly disrupted their command and control. They're very dependent on these devices, and now they got to find some replacement to control their forces. So a real advantage there, and you might say a real deterrent effort. By doing this, Israelis demonstrate their technological prowess and might deter Hezbollah from moving towards an escalation of the conflict. On the other hand, Hezbollah might view themselves as now being painted into a corner. And if we don't react in a big way, well, we've become marginalized. We're not exactly all that terribly important in the eyes of powers in the region. So what happens next is the real question. Is this a tactical success, which might lead to a strategic failure, a bigger conflict, or might it lead to a strategic success should Hezbollah deem themselves to, in fact, be deterred? So far, at least the Israelis have not exploited whatever advantages. One might think you would do this and then begin a major offensive, a major ground offensive, or a major air offensive against your adversary while they were in a certain degree of command and control chaos. But so far, at least, the Israelis have not exploited that particular opportunity.
Well, to some degree, have they in that they are expanding their efforts in the West Bank, right? I mean, no crisis. Every crisis is an opportunity, and it would seem that the Israelis are going to sort of encroach further and further and take more control of the West Bank.
Certainly, they have expanded their military operations in the West Bank. They actually had begun doing that even prior to this particular incident happening. But they'd had control of the West Bank really for many, many years. And so there's not really an expansion of territorial control. If I'm a military officer in Israel right now, what I'm worried about is how many resources have I got? Let's count the number of fronts we've got. Okay, we've got the Gaza Strip. That's a front. We've got northern Israel. Well, that's a front. We got the Houthis shooting us in the south. So we've got to position some forces to intercept that particular effort, as well as the Iraqis shooting from Iraq militia groups. Then we got more forces having to go into the West Bank to control unrest that's going on right there. So I count about 5 fronts right now that we've gotten to, in fact, resource. And it appears to me, anecdotally at least, that the Israelis are becoming more and more concerned about how far we can stretch our forces. Witness 2 decisions. One, Israelis about a month ago unveiled a decision whereby young men who are very conservative, religious Jews who are exempted from military service can now be drafted. This is a social upheaval in Israel. May not sound like a big deal. This is a huge deal. And then in the last few days, there's been an announcement whereby asylum seekers, most often Africans, who are living in Israel, can in fact get Israeli citizenship by joining the IDF. That was unveiled. So this suggests to me that this number of fronts we have and the length of this war is having a greater and greater impact on Israel in terms of its manpower resources, its military materiel, and probably overall its economy.
Now, you mentioned in passing the Houthi missile that was shot into central Israel. Is there any sense that we've talked a lot in previous webinars about drone technology and the success the Houthis have had using drones to disrupt traffic shipping in the Red Sea? Is this missile a technological step change? Is that a concern for you?
There's a lot of mystery about this particular missile. For one, the Houthis claimed it was a hypersonic missile, which would mean one that could fly very, very fast, several times the speed of sound, making it very difficult to intercept. Now, the Israelis have said that's not true. That's a lie. That's untrue. They were able to shoot it down, and any damage was caused by debris. But still, in all, I've not seen independent verification either way, number one. Number two, where did this missile come from? Well, the Houthis have some of their own, internal manufacturing, but not for really advanced weaponry. So was this weaponry provided by Iran, for example, which would be the most likely source? Iranians have said, no, we haven't had nothing to do with it. So the type of weapon, where it was produced, are some very, very important questions as we try to ascertain, as you're suggesting, Tim, what's the longer-term impact on this in this conflict in terms of the kind of attacks that the Houthis may be able to mount in the future. But keep in mind the following thing. We've done about 500 airstrikes against Yemen since they began intercepting commercial vessels in the Red Sea. Doesn't seem to have deterred the Houthis so far.
Yeah.
Right now, the United States Navy in the Red Sea is operating at a military operational level that the United States Navy hasn't done since World War II in terms of the intensity of almost day-to-day actions against the Houthis.
Yeah. Well, 10 or 15 years of the Saudis bombing Yemen hasn't seemed to deter the Houthis by very much either.
Exactly right. 110% correct.
All right. So go ahead, Drew.
Sure, Drew.
Yeah, just to kind of, while we're talking about these different, paramilitary groups, I wonder, can you envision a situation in which, the Lebanese society or military gets sick of Hezbollah enough where they, make moves to oust them? Because even if they're sympathetic to the Palestinians, which I'm sure many of them are, they must be getting sick of Lebanon being a perpetual war zone every decade or 20 years.
Well, you put your finger on it. There's a lot of reason to believe that there is severe disquiet amongst the Lebanese population towards Hezbollah. But Hezbollah is enormously powerful, particularly in the south. And frankly, the Lebanese military, who would have to be the force to counter that, is pretty weak, to say the very least. But Lebanon, sadly, has become an impoverished society over the last couple of decades. and extended conflict by Hezbollah with Israel obviously is not going to improve that situation. A couple of years ago, we had this detonation of this huge supply of fertilizer. You may recall the port of Beirut, which from the explosive standpoint had the equivalent of a small yield nuclear weapon and devastated the port of Beirut, critically important to the nation and its economy. And right now, wholesale inflation going on in Lebanon, high levels of unemployment going on in Lebanon. So the Lebanese people, you're quite right, really don't want another war right now, land war with Israel in particular. And after Israel demonstrated this high level of technological sophistication, probably even less interested, quite frankly, in a conflict. But as I said before, I think the problem for Hezbollah is to back down right now is going to be a pretty heavy admission of weakness on their part, number one. And then again, number two, I think the bigger question may be, is this a decision that occurs in Beirut? Or frankly, is this a decision that occurs in Tehran? Because if Hezbollah is going to lock up in a major land conflict with the Israelis, they're only going to do that if they get a green light from Tehran, because they're then going to be looking to the Iranians to provide more military assistance, more ammunition, more supplies to sustain that type of conflict, if not an outright intervention by the Iranians. And it seems to me, at least, the current Iranian government, which has come to power, may be also, at the moment at least, not terribly interested in that.
Mm-hmm. All right, let's move on. It doesn't look like we're going to make any progress anytime soon, to say the least, to oversimplify the situation in Israel. I assume the same can be said in the Ukraine, and you mentioned the massive explosion that happened in the port of Beirut. There was a massive explosion in a munitions facility in Russia recently. Let's talk a little bit about that and Ukraine's offensive into Russia.
Yeah, just in the last couple of days, there's been this massive attack by the Ukrainians. I think they used 8 suicide drones against this huge ammunition facility that the Russians had somewhat north and east, of course, of Kyiv and of Ukraine. And to the point when this thing exploded, it registered 2.5 on the Richter scale as far away as Poland. So this was like an earthquake. So the amount of munitions that the Russians had there must have been stunning, not only in terms of artillery ammo, there's reports of Iskander missiles, et cetera. So not only is this an indication of how using more, sophisticated technology, in this case, drones, a country like Ukraine can reach out and touch somebody. But number two is going to have serious implications for the Russians in terms of their ongoing efforts in the Donbass region, their ongoing efforts to resupply all of their forces operating in Ukraine. Russians depend enormously on artillery. Some reports at times of them firing up to 5,000 artillery rounds every single day. Well, they just lost probably tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of artillery shells in this one single explosion. You're also right, Tim, in the last month or so, of course, the Ukrainians did the surprise invasion of Russian territory. And I want to stress this is Russian territory in the Kursk Oblast. This is not territory that was secured by the Russians when they invaded in 2014 or invaded Ukraine in 2022. This has always been part of Russia, making it particularly startling. They have secured about 500 square miles. They've secured about 100 small villages and towns. But what's interesting is in a matter of about a week, they took as much Russian territory as the Russians have captured in Ukraine in probably the last 4 or 5 months. Okay. Obviously embarrassing to Mr. Putin. Obviously a psychological plus for the Ukrainian people and for the Ukrainian military. Probably a bit of a plus for Ukrainian allies who say, that's gives us some cause for optimism. But right now, at least, again, the longer term effects is always the question. And one of the reasons that the Ukrainians conducted this operation was their hope that this would cause the Russians to redeploy forces that were conducting offensive operations down in the Donbass, down in very southeastern Ukraine, divert those forces to halt this Ukrainian offensive. So far, at least, it does not appear to me that the Russians have diverted significant forces, maybe some, but not enough. That operation in the southeast has continued, albeit at a very slow pace, a few miles a day. But at the pace of them also, the Russians, suffering about 1,200 casualties every single day. But they're on the verge of taking a town called Pokrovsk. in southeastern Ukraine in the Donetsk Oblast. If they're able to capture Pokrovsk, that will be a significant operational success for the Russians because Pokrovsk is very important logistically as a major railroad hub, road network hub that's important to the Ukrainians to resupply their forces in the region. I don't see this as a catastrophic success or by the Russians or failure by the Ukrainians, though it's not. It's operationally quite important because one thing, it does not appear on the Russian side that they have sufficient manpower and forces and material available, even if they were to make a major breakthrough, that they could exploit that particular opportunity. And furthermore, as we get into October, this becomes the rainy season in Ukraine. It becomes a real bog, particularly in southeastern Ukraine. And this makes offensive operations, particularly with heavy armor, trucks, resupply, all those things which are difficult on any given day, that much harder.
Right. And one of the things you've talked about is that Russia is probably kind of getting to November. And once we see the outcome of the U.S. elections, that may be really determinant of what the Russian strategy is then going forward.
Oh, absolutely correct. I mean, if you're Mr. Putin, you have for quite a time, I believe, thought that your willpower was far superior to the West and the United States. If you could just hang on, that you would eventually get your way. He watched the debate, I'm confident, or got a report of the debate between Mr. Trump and Ms. Harris a few weeks ago. And in that, you may recall Mr. Trump was asked twice, if he wanted Ukraine to win, and just ignored the question. But it said he could end the war in one day. Well, the only way you're going to end the war in one day is basically cede to the demands of Vladimir Putin. So one way of ending a war is obviously to surrender. And if you cede to Mr. Putin's demands, I guess you could get the war over in a day. So if you're Putin, you're watching that election, it's about 50-50. You say, if Mr. Trump wins, I'm going to get what I want in Ukraine. Why should I negotiate at this particular moment? And the answer is no reason.
Yeah. And let's assume the polls recently in your home state of Pennsylvania have swung pretty meaningfully towards Harris. Let's just for a minute assume that Harris wins the presidency. And I know it's hard to read the mind of the madman, but he's lost so much in resources, right? He's lost his young people. You had a tremendous brain drain. One of the things that I talk about in the energy industry, and we'll talk about Venezuela in a little bit, is that if you don't reinvest resources in oil facilities, you lose the ability to take advantage of those resources. Is there any thought in your mind that Putin would, in the advent of a Harris victory, maybe pull back?
It's a possibility. Mr. Zelensky, President Zelensky, is coming to the United States here in a few weeks. Supposedly going to meet with President Biden, supposedly going to meet with President Trump. He's going to probably appear at the UN opening of the General Assembly in early October. And in the course of that, he's going to lay out his victory plan. And part of that victory plan includes in December a peace conference, a negotiation of a peace conference. He had one in June, which was held in Switzerland. Russians didn't attend. For December, at least, Mr. Zelensky said the Russians will be invited. So the scenario you paint, if Ms. Harris is elected, perhaps that might make that negotiation a bit more opportune. And what changes on the battlefield could also affect that. So that's certainly a possibility. I think Mr. Putin also is becoming more and more concerned, as you suggest, on the economic impact. Shortages of labor as he expands his economy on a defense base. Well, that pulls labor from other aspects of the economy. So they're having a severe labor shortage. High levels of inflation. We worry about inflation in the United States. Well, how do you like 9 or 10% inflation? That's what it is in Russia right now. We talk about interest rates, and the Fed dropped it at 0.5 percentage point yesterday, and everybody got very excited. How do you like 16% interest rates, which is what they are in Russia right now? So the effect on the Russian economy, and most economists I read suggest that Mr. Putin can't really increase his defense output much more than he is right now without totally distorting his economy. So his production of weaponry is probably about plateaued, and he's burning through it at a rapid rate. Tim, it's interesting. I was looking over some analysis of Chinese media in the aftermath of the Ukrainian invasion of Kursk. And the Chinese saw this as pretty disturbing because to them it suggests Mr. Putin, A, is not winning this particular war, number one. And they went on to talk about, well, this means that the Russians will become what? Increasingly dependent on us, increasingly dependent on China for many of the reasons you suggest. One thing that's certainly dried up with all the economic sanctions is foreign investment. And again, as you're the expert on energy, energy has to be reinvested to keep modernizing and replacing your infrastructure and facilities. Not any Western foreign investment is going to pour into Russia in a big way, at least as long as this war is going on. So if you're Putin, you've got to reinvest. Where are you going to turn to for foreign capital? And the only place, of course, is the Chinese. Where are you going to sell your oil and natural gas? Not going to sell it to the West. I'm going to sell it to the Chinese, but they're going to demand bargain-based prices, which they're going to do to purchase that. So I think the problem for Mr. Putin economically becomes more and more dire as this war goes on.
Yeah, and you've made that point. Xi may be a friend to Russia, but he's going to make Russia pay for that friendship.
This is I think we talk, no offense, I think we talk too much about their friendship. This is transactional.
Right.
This is transactional.
Yeah. Okay. And then speaking of Xi, 60 Minutes just did the piece on just how aggressive they have been with the Philippines. I was looking at a slide deck that you created recently where you talked about there is a lot of complexity to defending Taiwan because of some of the outlying islands around Taiwan. Why don't we just talk a little bit about what the Chinese appear to be doing there in the South Pacific?
Yeah, what the Chinese are doing in the South China Sea and also in the East China Sea is trying to normalize their argument that these are basically Chinese lakes. Now, way back when, 10 years or so ago, this was adjudicated by the International Court in The Hague over competing claims on the parts of this particular water area. When we focus on the Philippines, we focus on Taiwan. It's important to understand that there are a whole bunch of countries that are involved in overlapping claims to economic zones in the East and the South China Sea. Vietnam, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, as well as the Philippines, and to some degree, Taiwan as well. In the case of the Philippines, what we saw in that 60 Minutes piece, that has happened a number of times, is Filipino efforts to resupply some of their outposts on smaller islands out, offshore. One is near a place called Second Thomas Shoal, and that was the area that they were resupplied in the video on 60 Minutes, and being attacked by Chinese coastal vessels, Coast Guard vessels, saying, "No, this is Chinese territory." But if you look at a map of this is clearly within the Filipino exclusion economic zone of that country under the Law of the Sea Treaty, number one. Number two, just in terms of geography, Second Thomas Shoal is about 60 miles from one of the principal parts of the archipelago that makes up the Philippines. It's 600 miles from the Chinese mainland. So that gives you some idea of what the Chinese are claiming in this particular effort. And obviously, this has wide-ranging effects for the United States. Mr. Biden, when this occurred, ramming of one vessel against another, quickly gave a speech in which he said, quote unquote, there's a mutual defense treaty between the United States and the Philippines, which is ironclad. The United States has expanded its bases in the Philippines since Mr. Biden became president. We have now 9 bases in the Philippines. The United States has transferred medium-range missile systems to the Philippines, which can strike Chinese mainland from the Philippines. Chinese aren't happy about that. And then the President of the United States has hosted President Marcos at the White House even the last year or so. So there's increasing ties between the United States and the Philippines. So this kind of a confrontation obviously is of concern because obviously it could spin out of control into a major confrontation involving not only the Philippines and China, the United States as well.
Well, one of the themes that you talk about is the risk of black swan events, right? And when you have as many sort of theaters that are ongoing, the odds of one of those black swan events increases. Talk a little bit about where you see some of those potential risks.
Sure. We can develop any of those we want. Obviously, the South China Sea, Taiwan is certainly one of them. As you mentioned a little ago, people look at Taiwan and worry about the invasion of the Taiwan mainland. Well, that's a possibility. But there's a number of very small islands which are part of Taiwan, which are very, very close, only a few miles from the Chinese mainland. So some operation by the Chinese to normalize military efforts around those small islands, some effort to interrupt fishing by Taiwanese in those areas, those kind of things could escalate as well. So that's one area, South China Sea, Taiwan, that could be a black swan almost overnight if somebody bumps into somebody. Venezuela is another one. I thought it was interesting. Not only did President Maduro fix this election, but now his opponent, who may have got as much as 70% of the vote, has now fled to Spain. So Mr. Maduro has taken control. But, Tim, he may not be quite as confident about his ability to control the country. He recently announced that he was so happy about being reelected that he was going to change the date for Christmas. And we're actually going to have Venezuelans celebrate Christmas in October as a big surprise and gift to the Venezuelan people. Now, I'm not sure that's going to solve the 50% or 80% poverty level in Venezuela right now, but maybe he thinks it will. But you could have a major event involving Venezuela, either their efforts to move into Guyana, which they have talked about, number one, as a diversion, or, frankly, a massive refugee flow, which some people fear. We've had about 7 million Venezuelans leave in the last 5 years. That's a possibility. Certainly, another possibility would be a terrorist attack, let's be candid, against the United States or a major Western country. In the last couple of weeks, it was revealed that the son of Osama bin Laden, the guy named Hamza bin Laden, who we thought we'd killed in 2019, had in fact survived. He is supposedly taking control of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. There are some efforts of an effort on his part to reorganize al-Qaeda in Afghanistan to conduct worldwide terrorist attacks. In adjoining Pakistan, we have seen a dramatic increase in terrorist attacks by the TTP, the Pakistani Taliban, to the tune of over 300 attacks since the beginning of this year in Pakistan alone. So a terrorist attack is always a concern. North Korea always is a major concern because Kim Jong-un is often very likely to do something sadly stupid to get attention. And so I can envision between now, frankly, and the election, Kim Jong-un doing a nuclear test, firing a missile across Japan, or something in a provocative fashion, which obviously could escalate. And then last but not least, we circle back to the Middle East where we started this discussion. Any type of a confrontation or escalation in the Middle East could bring the United States and Iran into a confrontation that could result in not only the closure of the Red Sea, a major waterway, but more importantly, a closure of the Straits of Hormuz in the Persian Gulf, which is where the vast majority of Kuwaiti, Emirati, Saudi, and Iranian oil transits through this very narrow straits of only about 50 miles or so. And we could see oil prices, which right now, I looked this morning, around $71, $72 a barrel, something like that. We could see a dramatic escalation in oil prices almost overnight if the Straits of Hormuz were closed due to that kind of a confrontation.
And who would that be? Look, that's a two-edged sword for the Americans, right? The Americans want to weaken Iran. They want to stop their flow of funds through oil. So we might have an interest in doing something in the Persian Gulf. But the other risk of that is from a political standpoint, it's hard to win an election at $100 oil, and it's hard to run a populist campaign. So how would you see that playing out?
Well, just as I think you suggested, I mean, between now and the election, on the Biden administration in particular, and therefore, frankly, I'm interested in seeing Vice President Harris get elected, becoming involved in a major confrontation internationally is probably not going to help that particular effort. So I think there would be an effort to avoid that. Number two, I think the Biden administration is right now trying to test the following proposition. You have a new government in Iran, which appeared here in the midst of all this conflict, ended up by a guy named Pezeshkian, who ostensibly has talked about what? Well, he's talked about negotiations with the West. He's talked about curbing his nuclear programs in return for some reduction in economic sanctions. Does he really believe that? Is that really an earnest effort on his part or so much propaganda? It seems to me, at least, the Biden administration would want to test that proposition prior to becoming embroiled in some kind of a direct conflict. Furthermore, quite candidly, unfortunately, I think Mr. Netanyahu in Israel knows full well that he can prosecute any kind of a conflict he wants between now and November, because the one thing that's not going to happen is the United States of America is not going to get, and frankly, into a political conflict with the Israelis, threaten to reduce, for example, military weaponry to Israel in an effort to get the Israelis to move towards a ceasefire. That's not going to happen between now and then. So to some degree, Mr. Netanyahu as well, I think until November has a blank check. But then everything changes after November. And really right now, based on the nature of this election, polarization, et cetera, and all the conflicts in the world, seems to me one of the most dangerous periods of time, maybe from the end of our election in November until the inauguration of the next president. That actually may be a particularly dangerous period of time because now the political calculations have changed dramatically. Whoever wins, Trump or Harris.
All right. Well, we're at 40 minutes here. You've been incredibly generous with your time. Drew, any other questions?
No, I just, I guess one question, I would have is, what do we see in terms of kind of the conflict in Sudan and just kind of refugee diaspora worldwide, if that causes any more sources of conflict that we might not have talked about, whether it be spillover effects of different regions?
Yeah, good question, Drew. As we focus our attention on the catastrophe in the Ukraine, now over 1 million people have been killed or injured in the war in Ukraine on both sides. 1 million people. Or if you focus on the war in the Gaza Strip, where we had now over 100,000 Palestinians killed or injured. Still in all, the largest humanitarian disaster on the planet is Sudan, without question. There's 10 to 12 million people who are refugees now, internally or externally in Sudan, because of this ongoing conflict between basically two rival warlords. That's what it boils down to. And unfortunately, we see other countries piling in to support one side or the other. The Emiratis are involved. The Saudis are involved. The Egyptians are involved. The Russians are involved. There's some evidence the Wagner Group has sent some of their guys down on one side or the other. That has to do with exploiting the resources that Sudan has, even though it's a poor country, has a significant amount of oil, significant precious minerals, and it has a big coastline on the Red Sea, which is not unimportant. So I don't see a massive refugee flow affecting us globally or even in Europe. But the real problem is how it affects things regionally. And all across Central Africa, we talk about Chad, Niger, places like that, very, very unstable places. Many of them have had military coups. The one country that has really, I think, been affected the most, we don't talk about, is imagine you're Egypt. Very important to the United States. Well, in the north, you've got this concern about the war in the Gaza Strip. And will this result in a massive flow of maybe 1 million or more Palestinians flowing into Egypt? To your west, you have Libya, which is Hobbes' state of nature on a good day. Okay. And so that's not exactly going very well. And then to your south, you have Sudan, 12 million, 14 million refugees displaced within the country, and already hundreds of thousands of refugees moving into southern Egypt. The effect long term, and of course, the interruption of commercial vessels passing through the Red Sea and ultimately through the Suez Canal, which is one of the major revenue sources for the Egyptian government. So Egypt, a very important country in the United States, is affected big time by the Sudan as well as these other conflicts. And that, I think, is a major concern.
Excellent. Excellent. As always. All right. Well, we'll get you back and we'll talk about all of this again, maybe after the election, and we'll see how things have changed then. But thank you, as always, Colonel McCausland.
Thank you, Tim. Drew, you guys take care.
Yeah, thank you.
That'll do it.